the amazing Stephen Friedman. First of all, we would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And my name is Aliyah. I'm the new outreach coordinator here at American Space Almaty. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And of course, big thanks to Eric Meyer and to Stephen Friedman for joining us as well today. So let's get started our speaking in our talks, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Eric Meyer. I'm the U.S. Consul General here in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And I'd like to welcome all of our viewers back to the resumption of our philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. There may be some new viewers here. And for those of you who are new, I did want to let you know that these are all recorded and you can go back to see some of Stephen's prior talks on our YouTube channel. I want to, Steve, by the way, is broadcasting live from the United States, from Southern California, from Los Angeles. And last year, over the last several months, Stephen took us on an amazing journey through many different topics and subjects, all through a philosophical lens. And Stephen, by the way, is not only a philosopher, he went to medical school. He's an artist. These are actually some of his poles, some of his artwork behind me here. Stephen is a polymath, someone who has a great depth of knowledge on a wide range of subjects. And Stephen, we're really glad to welcome you back to the talk. So I want to thank you for volunteering your time on behalf of the U.S. Consulate. And with no further ado, I present to you the New York Times acclaimed genius philosopher, Stephen Friedman. Thank you, Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Eric. I really appreciate that very kind introduction. I also want to extend my thanks to the consulate in Almaty, the U.S. consulate, and everyone involved in making these talks possible. I'd like to welcome Aliyah, our new moderator. I'd also like to thank Nignaz, Elmira, Tracy, and everyone that's facilitated these weekly explorations of philosophy and its applications in a variety of directions, in an enormous number of directions. In fact, philosophy, as I think we've been getting a sense of, is the one field that deals with everything, that deals with every field. There's a philosophy of science, a philosophy of mathematics, a philosophy of art, of religion, of psychology. You know, whatever the enterprise is, there is a philosophical approach and a philosophical evaluation of the enterprise, its methodology, what it is, what it means, what it hopes to accomplish. So philosophy is actually the broadest of all human enterprises. And our weekly talks focus, you know, on different topics, partly as an illustration of that range and that depth of philosophical reach. Now, one thing in relation to that, philosophy isn't easy. It's not easy for me to do philosophy. It's not easy for me to talk about it. And I'm sure it's not easy to hear it, to receive it, especially if it's not something that's highly familiar. And a lot of my philosophical results are not likely to be highly familiar because I don't typically find them elsewhere. And that's part of the reaction I've had when I've talked in different parts of the world, that some of the things that I'm saying or some of the more significant or substantial things I'm saying are being received as new to the audience. So it takes time to familiarize yourself and get comfortable. It's, you know, the overarching theme of tonight is education, like teaching philosophy, introducing philosophy to human beings, right? Why and how? That's the specific title. But it's it also has sort of a subtitle. If you've read the summary, you see that I make reference to teaching critical thinking, that one of the major focuses of education is such teaching. I mean, education actually has a number of different major components. One is training, just training in fundamental skills. Another is understanding ideas, receiving new ideas in a variety of different directions. But the third and most important is evaluating those ideas, developing a critical response to them. There's a friend I have in Kazakhstan, actually in Karaganda, who's an English teacher. She has a school that she directs for teaching English, to people, students in Karaganda. A few weeks ago, actually about 6 weeks ago, she was writing an article on teaching critical thinking. And she asked me for my comments, my perspective, on that topic. And what I sort of quickly realized as I was thinking about, what to discuss with her about it was that critical thinking is philosophy. Philosophy isn't so much a body of knowledge as it is a technique and an activity. We see that most clearly in really the first major figure in Western philosophy, Socrates. In Plato's dialogues, which detail conversations or construct conversations between Socrates and other individuals over various philosophical issues, Socrates is not presenting dogma. He's not presenting a settled view of the world. He's raising questions, and he's mostly investigating what we now call epistemology, which many people consider the core of philosophy. It certainly was for Socrates. It's simply the effort to examine if we know, and why we know, and how we know what we think we know. It's an investigation into the nature of knowledge, our claims to know anything. That's a critical enterprise. That is an enterprise in critical thinking, critical evaluation. So when we are teaching people philosophy, we're really teaching them how to be critical thinkers and evaluators, ultimately, of what they're receiving. Now, there are several aspects to that I wanted to touch on. First, Confucius emphasized that a key to understanding is getting the words right, using the correct words in the correct context. Now, there's a lot of focus in philosophy on language, the use of language, the nature of concepts, because it's in the form of language that all questions that we're addressing arise, are formulated. The issue of getting clear on the nature and precisely the meaning and the application of the words that we're using is part of the critical enterprise. And let me give you some examples. When I was in college, I was taking a course once on Wittgenstein. I think people that have been with us know that Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher, Austrian, English philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, is probably the philosopher that's been the major influence on my work. Certainly the philosopher I most admire. At this point, probably considered the greatest philosopher in the Western tradition since Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. And before that, Aristotle. So he's at the highest level, of philosophical insight and achievement. Well, I was taking a course on Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. He actually only wrote 2 major works, one that was published in his lifetime, early in his life, and the other that was published posthumously. Philosophical Investigations, that I've again made reference to in the past, was published after his death. The professor of the course was Stanley Cavell, one of the world's most eminent philosophers at the time, one of the most impressive figures at the Harvard Philosophy Department. Cavell liked to do close textual analysis. Like much of his manner and method of doing philosophy was to take the text, whatever it might be, in this case, Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. In other cases, it might be Thoreau or work by Derrida, whatever. He focused on the text and would do careful sort of analysis, explication, of the text and philosophical issues that it might raise. Well, at one point, and I don't know exactly what was being discussed because I wasn't always totally focused, in my classes. I was much more given to reading, philosophy, reading Wittgenstein on my own than receiving lectures on Wittgenstein or any philosopher. But at one point, I heard somebody raise the question, of Stanley Cavell. And it was obviously in relation to something in the text that Cavell had just been commenting on. Again, I don't know what that was. But the question was, what's the difference between something that's ambiguous and something that's unclear? In both cases, we don't understand. But is the nature of our failure to understand the same in both cases or different? Well, Cavell paused. There was a pregnant pause as he kind of lapsed into thought. And while he was doing this, everybody in the class, you could tell, was thinking themselves, like, how would I articulate the distinction between something ambiguous and something unclear? And maybe 10 seconds later, Cavell says, something is ambiguous if we don't know which of 2 things it means. Something is unclear if we have no idea what it means. Now, and that there was a gasp and like a sigh of relief. There was almost like a philosophical tension that was created by the question, and then a release with the clarification. That's actually typical of what happens in the course of the achievement of philosophical clarity, precision, understanding. Well, it turns out, I later found out, that distinction between the ambiguous and the unclear is a famous distinction in philosophy, something that had been written about, that was in the literature. Probably Cavell had been aware of that or been exposed to that. And his pause and his thinking might have been just to recall what he had probably already encountered. But still, it's an illustration of what is central to part of the philosophical enterprise, precision. And it's that kind of precision that's valuable, right, in any educational context. It's essential for clear appreciation, communication, understanding. Another example. I did a play a few years ago, Phalaris's Bull, that actually we made available the film version of to people during World Philosophy Day, November 19th, a few months ago. In that play, I cite an example of doing a problem in arithmetic. I noted that, like, when I was in the 3rd grade, on a test, I made a mistake. I went 8 times 4 is 24. A mistake, right? 8 times 4 is 32, not 24. But I made a mistake, and I remember that mistake, to this day. And that's a mistake, in the sense that it doesn't raise questions about the nature of mathematics or arithmetic. It's something that, 8 times 4, the 4, 24, I can see how my mind might have momentarily made that error, okay? And it's something that, as a mistake, we can move on past. We don't have to dwell on it. I mean, there might be contexts in which we do, but in general, a mistake is something that we can move on from, okay? But if I were to go to the board, let's say in that classroom, and do 8 times 4 equals 1,134.957, or if I did it today, couldn't be just dismissed as a mistake. It's too far off. That would be an incorrect, basically, application of that term, of that concept, mistake, and we would dismiss that kind of discrepancy between what we expect as an answer and what we're receiving. We would expect that to, well, initiate some further inquiries on our part. It's simply too far off to just dismiss out of hand. Well, now the question of how far off is too far off is actually not purely philosophical. It's something that's in the other direction, what I call heuristic, something I've been developing in the past and will return to, but depends on lots of other factors. But here's an actual instance, a significant historical instance of what I mean in terms of whether something is a mistake, properly characterized as that or not. In the 16th century, there was a Danish astronomer, nobleman, Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe had the means to construct an observatory. Now, this was before the invention of the telescope, before Galileo first started observing things through a telescope, but it was the most elaborate astronomical observatory, I think, created up till that time. It allowed for precise measurements of the positions of planets and stars night after night. And Tycho Brahe was as diligent an observer of the heavens as history records. So night after night, whenever it was possible, he made observations of planetary positions in relation to the stars. Okay? This went on for decades. Okay? Tycho Brahe's assistant was Johannes Kepler, the German mathematician and astronomer. On Tycho Brahe's death, Kepler inherited all of Tycho Brahe's observations. Now, Kepler knew the nature of the man, he knew the nature of his work, he knew how exacting he was, okay? What Johannes Kepler wanted was a mathematical relationship, some type of relationship that accounted for the planetary motions that Tycho Brahe had so laboriously recorded. Kepler spent 20 years on the project. Now, it didn't take him 20 years to come up with solutions. He was a brilliant mathematician. He had solutions after year 1 and year 2 and year 3. He had lots of solutions along the way. Solutions that accounted for most of the data, but not all of the data, okay? So at that point, Kepler has a decision to make. Does he publish some of these mathematical results that account for most of what Brahe had recorded, had observed, assuming that Brahe had made some mistakes, that some of the data was just not quite accurate, okay? Or does he keep persevering? Kepler, in other words, had to decide whether there were mistakes in Tycho Brahe's work or not. Kepler decided that from what he knew of Tycho Brahe, there were no mistakes. So he continued year after year until finally, 20 years into the effort, he formulated what are now known as Kepler's laws of planetary motion. That the sun is at the center of a focus of an ellipse, that planets are moving in ellipses, not in circles, that planets move faster, as they are closer to the sun, slower further away. There were 3 laws that Kepler was able to formulate. Well, but those laws were achievable by Kepler's devotion to the precision of Brahe's data, his unwillingness to dismiss discrepancies as mistakes. Newton came along. Newton was the first person to be able to explain Kepler's results, Kepler's laws, based upon a law of universal gravitation. That inaugurated modern physics, effectively modern science. Without the work of Tycho Brahe and the seriousness with which Kepler took that work and treated it, without the subsequent work of Newton, we may not have had a scientific revolution. We may not have had then an industrial revolution. Most of us would then never probably have been born. So the consequences of deciding whether we're seeing a discrepancy between what we might expect and what we're experiencing as a mistake that can be dismissed or as something significant that cannot just be passed over is vital. Okay? And that's also part of the philosophical orientation to understanding what we're encountering. A couple of other things of this nature, not in terms of so much the use of a word, but the type of statement that's appropriate in a certain context. Again, central to the critical enterprise of philosophy in understanding any activity, in understanding ourselves and in understanding our world. Prominent early 20th century philosopher is Alfred North Whitehead. Turns out he'd written a book, Science in the Modern World, that by accident was the first book I happened to read in philosophy. I was 12 at the time. I was young. I was reading science. I was interested in science. I went into a bookstore and I happened to see this book, Science in the Modern World, that I thought was about science. And so I bought the book. I remember very clearly, and it's also a story I tell in the play briefly. I was taking some math and science courses and computer courses actually at Caltech at the time. I was 12, but in those days it was safe to travel by bus. And it was a long bus ride from where I lived to Caltech. It would take like 45 minutes each way. And that allowed me time to read that book by Alfred North Whitehead. That turns out to be a book of difficult philosophy. That was my introduction to the subject. So that's another sort of approach to education in philosophy. Don't be afraid to introduce people, even if something is not quite, at a level that they might be able to grasp, to people at a young age. Gives them a feeling for it. It can sort of dispel some of the mystery, and I discovered like that repeated visitations, in visiting something day after day after day would lead increasingly to clarity, understanding, and understanding at a deep level. Because what you do at a young age can become intuitive in a way that later on it never quite will. I mean, we see this in all kinds of areas of human life. It's hard for any golfer to compete with a Tiger Woods who began golfing when he was 2 or 3. There's a level, of skill that becomes so endemic, to the person, the personality, the neurophysiology, that there's almost nothing that serves us well as introducing things, even if they're difficult, at young ages, okay, to allow for the beginning acquaintance with something. But Alfred North Whitehead made a couple of interesting comments that I still remember. One thing he said that's of profound significance, and it will relate to some themes that I've addressed previously and will continue to address. He said, what matters most decisively, those are circumstances of such great generality that no one ever sees them because they're always right in front of our eyes. Now, one of the things that I've stressed, one of the factors of that nature that is decisive in terms of what we might call the philosophical solution to the world, is that the world is different in different directions. Just that asymmetry provides a path to a philosophic solution. And when I say a philosophic solution, I mean a solution that rises to every possible standard of critical evaluation, okay? So that's one instance of what I sort of assimilated from Whitehead at a young age, okay? And again, the words are understandable. The concept might be a little bit elusive, but still. So I encourage introduction to sophisticated subjects young, not having them forced on people, but having them at least available, okay? Which, in fact, the internet provides that access to. But in terms of saying the right thing, or understanding what we would say under a certain context or a certain situation, which also is critical to the precision of the philosophical enterprise. Whitehead made the remark, when you're lost in the woods, the question you ask is not, where am I? You know where you are, you're lost. But where is everyone else? We orient relative to others in a wide variety of contexts. That also is a philosophical remark, a philosophical sort of perception and understanding, that we would say the one thing, even though we might think that we might say the other. One example that I like to use is if I have something like a pen, and I'm not a magician, I'm not going to try to make this into a magic trick, but if I'm holding a pen that suddenly disappears, vanishes, it's not a magic trick, it just is gone. The thing that we would say is not, that was a pen that just vanished into thin air. What we would say is, what was that? A hallucination, an illusion, a mirage, a dream? Was that ever even real? What was that? The point is that future experience can decide the nature of our past experience. That's summarized in some concentrated statements. I write philosophy aphoristically in concentrated statements, some that I've used before that apply here. The past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. That what happens next can decide our sense of what came before. And now typically, the course of events is not dramatically different from what we expect. But if it were to be, anything that we believe about the past can be altered. What we would say could be dramatically changed, could even be reversed, depending upon how radical the divergence from past experience has been. That relates to the question, is the world real or a dream? Is it something solid, substantial in some sense, or kind of as insubstantial as a dream as Shakespeare, liked to imagine? Well, depends on what comes next. If tomorrow we awaken to a totally different reality that persists, then we will look back upon this experience and our previous experience as having been insubstantial, as having been in the nature of a dream. Reality is a term of comparison. It's these kinds of assessments that are essential, in doing philosophy well, seriously, okay? A lot of philosophy involves imagining, a circumstance, and then almost like an actor, projecting yourself into it so carefully and so completely that you can evaluate what you would say in those circumstances. And it's often different from what you imagine you might. A related example, I mentioned like should this pen just vanish? That will change our sense of what this was. It could also change our sense of what a physical object is. And to show you how concepts and our statements are, well, the term is labile, or changeable, depending upon certain broad features of our experience that we're often not aware of, but that philosophy is trying to make us aware of because they are decisive in our assessment of the world, of the nature of what we're experiencing. Every now and then, we lose things, right? Everybody will misplace something, lose something. Much of the time, we'll find it again, right? I mean, I've had a habit, I've noticed, of misplacing things or not being able to recover something, find something, simply because it was where I thought it was, but not quite. Like maybe an inch or so, or 2 inches, one way or the other, and I reached for where I thought it was, and it had shifted, and I didn't find it, and then I start looking everywhere, okay? And at the end of that process, I go back and say, oh, if I only looked 3 inches the other way, that's typically, what happens with me. It actually happened with a cell phone in my car that, this is like over 10 years ago, that I had misplaced and did not recover for 3 months. It was under my seat, but not quite where I thought it was under my seat. And in the shifting of position, I just wasn't able, I just didn't find it, but I did 3 months later, okay? So the point is that most of the time, or we certainly had a lot of experience, misplacing things, losing things, and then finding them, okay? If, though, whenever we misplaced something, whenever we lost something, we never found it again, that would change our whole sense of what the physical world is, our whole sense of what an object is. That objects are stable, can exist, persist indefinitely, but then for no reason vanish. That's not our sense because, again, of the percentage of times that we recover what we misplace. But that's an illustration of just how a subtle shift in our experience, can dramatically change our whole sense of the nature of the world. That also is part of philosophical awareness, okay? Now, when I talk about critical thinking and the teaching of this sort of awareness, I don't typically, when I'm writing philosophy, use the term critical thinking. I use something that is a reasonable synonym for it. I talk about rigor. I talk about a result being rigorous, where rigor and rigorous is at the highest possible level of critical evaluation, critical thought. Now, it's a term that's commonly used, today. It's commonly used in the sciences, in all the sciences. It's social sciences, physical sciences. It's commonly used in mathematics. And it is the decisive standard of evaluation. If a mathematical result, a mathematical proof is not rigorous, it has not accomplished its goal. It has not proved anything. If a scientific experiment is conducted non-rigorously, we can't trust the results. We can't conclude anything definitive from those results. Rigor is the highest term of evaluation, probably in our intellectual culture at this point. Well, that's all philosophy is. Philosophy is the limit of rigor, applied in every possible direction. Philosophical results are rigorous to the point that they are incontestable. Now, typically that means they have something to do with the nature of concepts, because concepts are, to some degree, in our control, a product of our, kind of culture, human culture. But so when I say the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, that the rigor of that is largely based upon the nature of the concepts, the nature of the concept of past, the nature of the concept of futurity. But what's interesting is that even though I encounter rigor a lot, in talking about and writing about COVID and the search for vaccines and the evaluation of the course of the pandemic, I see that word, rigor, applied to, people's work on a regular basis. So I thought it was something that was widely appreciated as a term of, characterizing, respectable, acceptable, necessary intellectual effort and standards. But I have a friend, very well educated, very smart. Her husband, she's now widowed, but her husband was my mentor in molecular biology. Her husband was one of the world's most renowned molecular biologists. She worked with him. They did projects together in terms of patenting results. She has a close friend who was the head of the math department at a prominent, internationally prominent university. Well, last year, when I was doing these talks, my moderator for talks was Shirin. You would have met her, if you were joining us last year, and you'll see her, if you go and see some of the, recorded versions of the talks. Well, Shirin and I have embarked on a series of podcasts. We haven't issued any yet, but we're working on them. For the subtitle of the podcast, I chose The Limit of Rigor. And Shirin designed the poster for it. And I sent it to this friend of mine, whose, again, husband was that famous molecular biologist, and who is very bright and accomplished in her own right. And she said to me, okay, I like the poster, but this use of the word rigor, I don't really understand what it is, and I'm not sure people do understand what it is. Well, this came as a surprise to me, because I thought it was a word that was in widespread use currency. I thought it was something that, even if people didn't understand how to achieve a rigorous result, they had the sense of it. Apparently not, okay? So one of the things that we'll be discussing more and more is rigor, since that is philosophy. I've characterized it in the past, rigor is of difference, that we exist in difference from everything else. A rigorous space is one in which every distinction or difference matters decisively. Okay? So it turns out, as we'll see, that any two objects, any two people, any two elements of the world are approximately similar for some purpose or other, but rigorously different. And that difference in rigor is the most important aspect of philosophy and the most important aspect of a philosophical solution to the world, as we'll see. Now, to illustrate that and its relation to a major field of human enterprise where rigor is central, the sciences, I mentioned that this friend of mine, who was not that acquainted with the concept of rigor, was the wife of my mentor in molecular biology. His name, I'll give his name. His name is Donald Kaplan. He died about 25 years ago, but I worked with him actually at UCLA. Now, Don, as I said, was one of the eminent molecular biologists. He was one of the co-creators of immunotoxins, which created a whole field of molecular biology and biomedical intervention. He, being from Los Angeles, he also became a principal advisor, technical advisor on films, major films that happen to feature a genetic or a molecular biological component. So for example, he was the technical advisor on Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner, which is considered one of the classic science fiction films, a film about replicants, right? Like perfect robotic versions of human beings that nevertheless have a short lifespan. They only live 5 years or something. And there's actually a scene in the movie where the geneticist that was involved in the design of these replicants is being questioned about why they can't have a longer life. And the explanation he gives in terms of repressor proteins and was right out of our lab. Okay, so it's funny when I hear that, because I remember specific conversations when we were discussing not that film, but the concept, and the role of such proteins. Anyway, well, some years ago, Dawn's mother developed lung cancer, and she came to her son and she asked him, and he was in as good a position to advise as anyone, asked him, what should she do? What type of chemotherapy, should she undertake? What was his recommendation for how she should have this cancer treated? And he said to me afterwards, he says, I didn't know what to say to her, because in the entire history of cancer research, there has not been one well-controlled experiment. Not one. And this is, these are the words of one of the world's most accomplished molecular biologists, okay? He actually was understating the case. It turns out that in the entire history of science, there has not been one well-controlled experiment. Not one. Because controlled experiments cannot, in principle, theoretically, rise to the level of rigor that philosophy demands. And this is a profound circumstance. We'll discuss it again. I don't want to it would take time, and I know I've visited this issue, in the past. I visited in the play. Basically, the idea is that to do a controlled experiment, we need two identical things. And then we give one of those things, let's say we're doing an experiment in cancer, right? We're testing a new drug. So we have two identical individuals with two identical cancers. We give one a drug, another a placebo, a sugar pill, something that's not active in the way the drug is imagined to be. And we then observe them, and we see who lives longer, okay? Do that comparison. Well, but in order to draw a conclusion that's rigorous from that, those two individuals have to be identical. Now, again, from the highest standpoint of rigor, no two people can be identical, right? From the highest standpoint of rigor, no two things can be identical, because but here are a few reasons why. First of all, let's say one object is here, another object is here. One object is to the left of the other. They're in different surroundings. Any difference in outcome can be due to that difference in surrounding. Now you say, well, but that's a minor issue. Not from the standpoint of rigor. Not when it comes to the conditions for a philosophical solution to the world. Not when it comes to the conditions of a philosophical understanding of our true circumstances and what can ultimately address them convincingly. Now, it turns out that not everyone has had the appreciation of what I've just said to you. It's not that common. And it turns out that even if there were nothing in the world except for 2 points with no properties, so it's not the case that they're in different surroundings, still, rigorously, we could not draw a definitive conclusion because the 2 points are not in the same place. And so far as we know, that can be responsible for a different outcome of the drug versus the placebo. Einstein had an appreciation of that. That was close, not in terms of its undercutting of controlled experimentation. I never heard him write about that. But in terms of some of the conditions that led him to develop the general theory of relativity. And it was that general theory that was tested with a solar eclipse in 1919, where light was shown to be bent as it traveled in the vicinity of the sun and its gravitational field, that made Einstein an international celebrity. It was that theory, it's called the general theory of relativity, a theory of gravitation that revised the theory of gravitation of Newton's, that catapulted Einstein to international fame once it was validated, during the study of this eclipse. But the greatest, possibly, American physicist, Richard Feynman, one of the greatest, did not grow up in the philosophical culture that Einstein did. He was an American. America is not renowned for its philosophical culture, in the sense that when, and I've mentioned this before, when the first Harry Potter novel was published around the world, the title was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone everywhere except the United States, where Philosopher's Stone was changed to Sorcerer's Stone, because the feeling was people wouldn't respond to a title with philosophy in it. But Einstein, by the way, considered himself a physicist philosopher, and philosophy infused his thinking, infused his work. Well, towards the end of his life, Richard Feynman was giving a talk that I saw, a recorded talk, and he was talking about the fact that he understood a lot of Einstein's work, the sources of it, like the special theory of relativity, the theory that produced E equals mc squared, that he understood. He understood where those ideas came from. But Feynman said he did not understand, even at the end of his life, the ultimate source of the ideas of Einstein's general theory of relativity. Well, the ultimate source of those ideas turns out to have been philosophic, late 19th century German radical empiricism, just to give it a term. But it relates to the fact that two objects in two different positions are significantly different because of those positions. Okay? And because of that, but it actually, I can generalize this. Whatever allows us to say that we have 2 points or 2 objects or 2 people and not one is what makes theoretically a controlled experiment impossible. Impossible at the level of rigor that philosophy demands. What that means is that science is a system of belief. It's not rigorous at the level of philosophy. It's why there can be debates in culture. You know, why people can reject scientific results. Philosophical results cannot be rejected. Philosophical results are incontrovertible. They are firm no matter what. There is no choice involved. Okay, it's harsh, it's demanding, but it's demanding as it guides us to freedom and a type what the religions would call salvation. But science does not rise to that level, and it can be understood simply because a controlled experiment is theoretically impossible at a level of rigor to be commanding. So this is the kind of thing that we need to understand, right? That we need to come to appreciate. But just to show you how hard it is to appreciate even the centrality of controlled experiments. Towards the end of his life, Donald had suffered a heart attack. And as he was sick, and I was spending some time with him, he was lamenting the fact that he had eaten abusively earlier in his life, that he would buy half gallons of ice cream and eat the whole container of ice cream and do it not just once, but often. And he was agonizing over the fact that he had brought his health conditions upon himself with that eating habit. Well, when I first entered the laboratory, controlled experiments were, always the focus, and I learned the importance of them, the centrality of them in doing science from Donald, even though, again, they don't rise to the level of rigor that philosophy demands, right? But even as acquainted as Donald was with the concept of experimental controls, and even as he recognized that in cancer research, there had not been ever a sufficiently well-controlled experiment. I don't think he would have necessarily said that there could not theoretically be. That's, the philosophical sort of contribution to this discussion. But I explained to him, Donald, you can't go back in time. You can't go back in time, not eat those ice creams, and then see the course of events and compare. You cannot even begin to design the controlled experiment that could decide whether it was the ice cream that contributed or not at all, not even in principle. So you're racking your brain and you're anguished and you're regretful for no philosophically, rigorously justifiable reason. This is central to our understanding of the nature of rigor, what we can and can't do, because it can free us from ranges, of regret and despair and anguish that's simply not justified. Same thing applies in decision-making, generally. when we're making a decision, we like to consider possibilities, but what's really important, what's really decisive in evaluating decisions is evaluating the outcome. I mean, there might be lots of reasons to choose one thing over the other, but what we really care about is the better choice in the end. Well, we can't know, ever, for any decision, no matter what, in the sense that we would have to do some kind of experiment. We would have to, now, the example I often use is choosing between Harvard and Yale, those two universities, simply because it was a choice I had, and it was probably the longest decision-making process I've ever engaged in. I wasted a month on this, okay? Well, to evaluate any decision, including that one, I would have had to have gone to Harvard for some period of time, whatever, rewind, go to Yale, compare. But can't do that. What we can't do even further is, let's say we could do that. We could rewind. When would we stop the comparison? How would we know? Would we stop after 1 year, or 5, or 10, or 20? There's no stopping point. Something, one choice could seem like the better choice 25 years in, but suddenly reverses at year 26. But still theoretically possible. And even if we could rewind, and even if we could know when to stop, we still wouldn't know what should have been the initial terms, of the choice. Maybe it was Harvard and Yale, but maybe, Princeton, or maybe an island somewhere, or maybe an infinite number that almost, of alternative possibilities that we can't in the end evaluate. But we make decisions, we go in one direction, and we rack ourselves, maybe because of the outcome, but we can't ever know. So again, with philosophy, we're dealing with the highest possible standard of rigor. And part of what's sort of contained in that commitment is, expressed in an aphorism: we suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably, not at a sufficient level of rigor. It applies in every direction. It applies in our evaluation, not just of decisions, but in our relationships to others. We hear that we shouldn't judge somebody unless we were able to walk in their shoes. Right? Now, it's obviously not quite enough to walk in someone's shoes. Right? We need to do better than that. We need to have been born into their skin and never have existed at all ourselves. Otherwise, there will be distinctions between our experience and their experience that we will not be able to assess. So, from the standpoint of rigor, given the nature of difference between any two people's circumstances, you can't judge. Not legitimately, not rigorously. This, too, is something that we want to acquire an understanding of. Now, in terms of how to achieve this understanding, there are different modes. The one mode that I tend not to use is writing like 500 or 1,000-page works in philosophy, because I find that they tend not to be read. I try to do things that are more concentrated. So one method of communication that I find effective is, as I mentioned before, the aphorism. A concentrated statement that summarizes a great deal of argument thought. It's hard to follow arguments. It's hard to reason through things. It's a little bit easier if one can write something that can produce an almost instantaneous awareness or understanding. And I find that a lot of people will have that experience with aphorisms, right? But I never know who might respond to what aphorism. I mean, some I've mentioned already, the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. Some others, I often write them in pairs. The riddle of the world is an object. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. Existence resolves to salvation. The incontrovertible solves the world. Just to hear them. The sound of the aphorisms, almost a certain musical element, matters, helps to communicate. I find I've had art shows where I've written the aphoristic contents of a book on the wall of the gallery. And then in the interior space, there might be like pole art, displayed. And I've had people who have visited, the art, seen the visual art, and then read the aphorisms, but not necessarily with understanding of their full, conceptual content. But they'll say to me afterwards, I wasn't quite grasping the aphorisms, but they communicated through their music, through their sound. That's intentional. Okay, But aside from that, I once, I think talked about, as an actual instance, a woman who worked in the gallery that represents me some years ago, without a background in philosophy. I don't think she'd gone to college. She'd been an actress, but then she gave it up to work in the gallery for a time. And I would bring in aphorisms as I was writing them and share them with the people in the gallery. She was especially engaged. And one day I brought in an aphorism I had just written. We suffer because we think the past is fixed and controls the future. But the reality is the opposite. The past is not fixed, and the future decides it. Again, it's a form of past can't guarantee future decides the past. And for some reason, that had an immediate impact. She wanted me to write it out. I did. She took it home, showed it to her husband. Her husband told her to post it above her desk, look at it every day. She did. She had a holiday party. It was around the end of summer. There was a party at her house that she had. A friend of hers came over at some point during the party. This woman couldn't find her friend. She found her in the den, staring at that aphorism above her desk in tears. And the woman who had worked in the gallery ended up quitting and going back to acting, inspired, she says, by that aphorism. So now I wouldn't have anticipated that. I never know in advance, but they almost can work like Zen koans, where they can produce, an almost immediate understanding. That's part of their design. I've written about 20,000 of them, so there are a lot to choose from. Another approach I take, and this also emphasizes music a little, is poetry. I've written about almost 200 books that are in full poetic form. They're aphoristic, but they're also rhyming and they have meter. They're short. Some of them might have as many as 30 aphorisms, others have just a few. Okay, so you can think of them as poems, they're books, but they're so concentrated, that I think of them as books because they cover a range of thought, even if they're short. And to show you, I'll recite one of these short books. I should also say that these books are designed to be done environmentally. Like I mentioned in the past that I did a book that was done in candles, tea lights, little candles, 5,000 little candles that spelled out all the words of like 30 aphorisms on the beach next to Santa Monica Pier. This was about 10 years ago. I did another book of, this poetic form of writing philosophy as a sky book over Huntington Beach in California. There are a variety of things that I imagine, or contexts that I imagine to put these books in that help them communicate, help teach the subject, make it available. So here's one. I just memorized it, so if I could remember it. The title is Sing a Ring of Lightning, a Circumferential Tightening. It goes, life was never pretext. We cannot know what comes next. However near, however far, what comes next decides what we are. Of love, hate, desire, fear, all along our claims were wrong. The hands of gods are lightning rods that carve precise demands. From head to toe, we know to go where singularity stands. So now it's concentrated, but it's concentrated in a poetic form, and the music, I think, helps convey some of the meaning. It certainly, I think, helps convey some of the consoling aspect, that's central to the philosophy, not by design, but by upshot. Philosophy, rigor, absolute, incontestable truth is the one thing that can satisfy that Christian prescription that the truth shall make you free. Rigor has that capability. And it has that capability, just to illustrate it briefly. We exist in difference from everything else. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist at all. We would be assimilated to something else. Every existent thing is distinguishable in some way from every other existent thing. Rigor is of difference, right? Any two things, any difference between any two things means that rigorously, whatever applies to one need not apply to the other, not rigorously. In what kind of world is death not certain? This world. Because of anything that distinguishes you from every other human being who has ever died. That distinction, that difference rigorously means that whatever has applied to others cannot automatically be applied to you, not at the level of rigor. So each of us is a singularity, which means that concepts such as disease, old age, death do not rigorously apply. The Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, when he was 29, up to then he had lived a sheltered life, but at the age of 29, he left the palace walls that his father had protected him within, and encountered visions of, or the experience of, disease, old age, death. He resolved from that experience to end them, to end disease, old age, and death. Now, going back to some of the original things I said, we could dismiss that as a mistake, or he's out of his mind, okay? Or we can take it seriously and see what he might have had in mind, what he meant by that. We don't gain very much if we just dismiss it out of hand, okay? But we can gain a great deal if we try to understand what he had in mind, what he was thinking. And if what he was thinking has any application to our circumstances. Well, he did not have laboratories, in molecular biology, 550 BC, that he could go into and find cures for everything. But the fact that Buddhism exists the fact that it has flourished, the fact that hundreds of millions of people over several thousand years have, followed, its basic elements, have subscribed to them, attests to the fact that Siddhartha was convinced he had succeeded in that enterprise, ending disease, old age, and death. Well, how do we even begin to understand that? Well, the way you end disease, old age, and death is either you go into a laboratory and you cure everything, you cure it definitively, or you find some means of ending concepts. Ending concepts, as I've written about, is no easier than curing disease in a laboratory. Okay? He was able to do it through a certain logic that actually has some components of belief in that logic. I mean, I've kind of given it in a variety of places. Basically, the logic comes down to the real lasts, in evaluating the real in comparison to dreams. So the real lasts, nothing lasts. That was the insight that he had under the Bodhi tree. Therefore, nothing is real, including disease, old age, and death. Whatever the logic and whatever the analysis, the problem is that that second proposition, nothing lasts, is a belief. We can't know that, okay? But philosophy can achieve that kind of stripping the world of concepts through rigorous means. That's how it achieves that type of end that a religion as aspirational as Buddhism felt it had achieved. But again, philosophy does it rigorously. The analysis of time actually can lead to that. Past can't guarantee the future. Future decides the past. You don't know what's going to come next. And what comes next decides the reality. But also, that analysis of basically the space that we're living in. And let me just give you a brief kind of characterization of it. It's something that we will come back to. It's a little bit more of the technical side, of the philosophy. But again, I think it's good to hear it, even if it's not fully comprehensible. I find that some people do understand, if maybe they have a mathematical orientation, if when I present the mathematical formulation, other people at some later point, as they understand the basic ideas, do use it as a summary. The aphorisms actually function that way too. Some people gain understanding of the philosophical analyses I'm presenting through the aphorisms. Other people understand some of what I'm saying, and then the aphorisms become a summary of it. Philosophic space, which I also call epistemic space. It's like one of the few terms I use that might be considered technical. It simply means something that we can know incontestably, know directly, immediately, without question. Okay? Rigor. So a philosophic space is also a rigorous space, which is also an epistemic space. That's what we're seeing around us, okay? What we exist in, okay? It's also an asymmetric space. It's different in different directions, okay? It's also a space without internal symmetries. Everything is distinguishable. No two things kind of fully mirror each other exactly, okay? It's also a divergent space. Things are distinguishable from each other, okay? Those are some terms that help characterize it. The fundamental logic of that space, A is not equal to A. There's no identity within the space. It's also a non-repetitive space. It is the existential space in which we live. It is the space that confers absolute dignity on each element, because each element is absolutely rigorously distinguishable from each other. And it is the space in which rigorously whatever general principles we imagine to apply need not rigorously apply at any given point. Okay? It's actually the landscape of Eden. The opposite, everything else that's not rigorous, that's not incontestable, that doesn't reach that level of philosophical rigor, is heuristic. It's belief, opinion, theory, assumption, point of view, individual kind of perspective on things, anything not at that level of philosophical rigor. It turns out that it's the space in which two things are approximately the same. The way to describe that space is it's a space where there are repetitions. It's the space in which we see things that are familiar because there are repetitions, approximate repetitions. It's a space in which any two things are approximately the same, rigorously different, but approximately the same. It's a convergent space. All the elements of that space can be described by varieties of elements coming together to form them, like we can be described in that space in terms of molecules, all the different components that we imagine to constitute us. It is a symmetry space, and its logic is A equals A. That's a complete summary. And then in terms of the relationship between those two spaces, now this gets a little more complicated, but I just want to tell you the limit of the heuristic is the epistemic. That right there, epistemic space, A not equal to A. Heuristic space, A equals A. The limit of the heuristic is the epistemic. The heuristic converges upon the epistemic. That's actually the solution to the world. That's the philosophical solution. Everything that I will ever say can be related to that formulation, that formalism. Okay? But again, that's, if you're of a mathematical kind of orientation, that may have an impact. But over time, I'll refer to it just so it becomes a little more, understandable. It's not anything to be afraid of. It's just something to become familiar with. And it's another summary, of what I'm saying. Another, maybe a final way of communicating philosophy, educationally to adults, to younger people, is through art. And the art that I do actually illustrates the relationship between the epistemic and the heuristic. The images that I'm painting are on the borderline between abstract and representation. When you first look at it, it looks abstract. As you continue to gaze, you will see recognizable imagery. That's the transition from the epistemic to the heuristic that you're experiencing. Oh, and by the way, in terms of, we're in epistemic space. That's existential space. That's what we exist in. You look around, that's what you're seeing. But the reason that you're not quite seeing it, what's blocking your vision from it is you're seeing a world of concepts. You're seeing things that are approximately the same. You're not seeing the rigorous differences in front of your eyes. You're not seeing the world in sufficient precision and detail. The way you know that you're seeing the epistemic, how it appears, it would appear the world that you would see if you first opened your eyes to it. That's one way to characterize it. It would be the world that you would see before you clustered things into objects, concepts, structured by concepts based on resemblances, similarities. It's the world, one way to characterize it, that world of Eden in which everything is strange and beautiful and new, moment to moment. That's the rigor, of epistemic space. We don't see that. Our survival is facilitated by the nature of our language, the clustering that language permits. And we are seeing that conceptual space from a very young age. It's why children are not drawing people that we recognize in the way Rembrandt was drawing people. Children are drawing stick figures, right? They're making circles and ovals for faces and lines for bodies and arms and legs. Not because that's what they're seeing And not because their hand doesn't have the dexterity. Drawing is not in the hand, it's in the eye, it's in the mind. Children are drawing stick figures because they are drawing their concepts of the world. By the time they are drawing, they already have conceptualized to the point where they're not seeing the primal reality, if you like. They're seeing something that has they've already been acculturated into a linguistic space. Heuristic space is also linguistic space. Things are clustered for certain purposes. It facilitates survival. It facilitates cooperation among human beings that facilitates our survival. It does not achieve the rigor of salvation. Okay, now I think that's a reasonable note to, well, actually, there's something else that I mentioned in the summary that maybe, when I'm talking about rigor, I'm obviously talking about certain high standards of evaluation, the highest possible standards of evaluation. The world of art has a different set of standards of evaluation that are comparative. And I illustrated that in the summary by a quotation from Goethe, the German writer whom I admire, and actually I discovered not too long ago was Einstein's favorite writer, okay? Goethe. Said, in art, the best is good enough. It's a matter of comparison. So an artist typically will learn his craft. A painter, for example, traditionally in France would go to the Louvre and copy masterpieces. That's how he would learn what distinguished a masterpiece from something else and something less, and what effort might be involved in reaching that level of artistic execution. Comparative. When I was younger, the Hollywood Bowl, that's a famous outdoor amphitheater that would have concerts during the summer, had on Wednesday nights what were called marathons, bowl marathons, where you would go and listen to music of a certain genre, classical music of a certain genre, for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours straight. The orchestra would play under the guidance of a conductor, sort of a well-known conductor and composer of the time, Lucas Foss, who's also an excellent educator. Well, once I went to the Baroque music marathon, and I sat there. I would arrive at the beginning and stay till the end. And for the first few hours, I was listening to the music, and they were playing music by Corelli and Vivaldi and lots of kind of Baroque composers, and it was entertaining, but not captivating until maybe 3 hours in. They played 2 Monteverdi madrigals. The difference was obvious. And it was obvious how Monteverdi deserved the reputation at the level of a Bach or a Beethoven or a Mozart. That's where I place him. And it was obvious only by being placed in a comparative context. So in art, we're dealing with comparative value, comparative worth, comparative power. In philosophy, when we're talking about rigor, we're talking about an absolute. The criteria of rigor are internal to the exercise of philosophy. Once one has achieved a rigorous result, there's no argument. It doesn't matter what you compare it to. It stands. And as I've written, only what stands against all possible force can answer our needs. Only the irresistible solves the world. Okay, I think that might be a good point to end on. Now, are there some questions? I don't have my glasses. Let's see. Did we I can't. Oh, good. They're in Russian, so I can't read them. Do we have some time, or a little bit, a few minutes?
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes before we finish, and also we've got 2 comments. I can read out the first one, which is says like the excellent, which gives the excellent grade, and the second one is hello everyone, so nice to see this program back. It's always so pleasant to listen to Stephen's explanations. Deep and clear, we did learn a lot from it.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that's Sharon. Okay.
Thank you very much for the comment. And the second comment, which it says excellent.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Super. Thank you.
And is there a question that anyone would like to ask, or?
No, there are no questions.
No questions. Okay. Okay. I guess we're basically, so I know you said you had some questions. Did you want to ask one now? Or?
Yeah, I would like to ask one question.
Okay.
Please share your thoughts. What is the connection between the self and the philosophy?
Between the self?
Yes, and the philosophy.
Okay. What immediately comes to mind, when you ask me that question, is the admonition of the Delphic Oracle. Again, at the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, know thyself, right? And the significance of that, the fundamental significance of that is we can't leave the world to view it from the outside. That no matter what, now we, in our thinking, we often imagine that we can, or imagine that we're doing something comparable to leaving the world. We're imagining putting ourselves in the position of other people. We're imagining the concept of a God, let's say, who is seeing the world from the outside. So we imagine what it might be like to see the world from that perspective. We imagine these things. It's our language gives us the capacity to embrace that type of conceptualizing, to go in that direction. But in terms of the rigor of our circumstances, everything has to be assessed. Everything has to be evaluated from where we stand in terms of ourselves. Now, from that perspective, there's a sense in which everything we see, everything we experience is an aspect of ourselves, an aspect of the self. Now, this is something that is actually embraced in a lot of traditional philosophy. The idea that we don't know what the world is like from the outside. We don't know how a squirrel or an eagle, a bird, a mouse experiences the world. We can do studies, but ultimately we have no idea, and we never will, and we never can. There are too many differences. But the colors we see the world in, our sense of the three-dimensionality of it is, in effect, a brain process, a function of what our brains are doing. So every aspect of experience that we see, literally everything that we experience is revealing something not just about what's out there, but about ourselves. And ultimately, when I talk about like a philosophic solution, it has to be achievable right here, right now, in terms of where we stand. Now, the most important thing about ourself is its singularity. The fact that we, as any other two things, are only approximately the same as anything else, rigorously different. There's this perspective, solipsism, the idea that we can't know that we don't know. It might be the case that we are the only entity, myself or yourself, that has real consciousness, an inner life. And that everything else that we see is just some sophisticated form of robot without a real mind, without consciousness. Okay, so that we are fundamentally alone in the world. Now, what's interesting about that is a possibility. It would be wrong to try to advocate to say that is the reality, because that's not knowable. Okay, but it's a possibility. And what's interesting is, if we were not able to communicate with other people, if we did not have language of any sort, if there was no communication of even through gesture, in other words, if no matter what we did, every other human being and every other living thing would just pass us by as if we weren't even here, there was no exchange, then we would not imagine that any other human being had an inner life. We would doubt that they had an inner life in the way that people often doubt that animals have an inner life. The degree to which we do that relative to an animal is the degree to which we do not communicate with animals. As we begin any kind of communication with them, we start to imbue them with the sense of consciousness. Actually, it's a feature of the nature of the communicative experience. But the single most important thing about the self is that we cannot be blind, no matter what. And so the solution to the world ultimately has to be experienced and embraced from where we are, right here, right now. If it's not embraceable right here, right now, it's not embraceable anywhere at any time. And it's philosophy that shows us how it's possible to achieve that and embrace that.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. In here, we are a bit running out of time, but I would like to read some of the comments as well. So in here, the first one says, okay, what are the effects of lockdown and quarantine on cognition and emotional well-being?
Okay, I think I'll leave that for next time.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
And,
right.
Yeah, we can leave it for the next session.
Yes. So please, we will start the next session. I will answer that question and any other questions you might have. Okay. I will begin the next session. So that's reason to join us. And
knowing the past, you understand the present, to some of the comments.
Okay, I can talk about that.
And also in here, thank you, Stephen, for this very interesting talk. It certainly makes one reevaluate their perspective on what we know, what we think we know, and what is our perception of reality.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
As well as this one as well from Eric Forsell says, we were always taught to believe that the past influences the future. Your view puts an interesting spin on this belief. Much food for thought here, and I'll contemplate what you have said further.
Good. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. I appreciate your participation, your help. It's invaluable. This wouldn't be possible without it. And it helps calm me down to have a moderator, because these are, as I said, it's not easy to listen to philosophy. It's not easy to discuss philosophy. So, it's a challenge in both directions. So I appreciate, your participation. I do.
And also, I would like to conclude our session for today. So we're going to have this amazing philosophical talks weekly. Please stay tuned with our social media and our updates. We're going to meet each other next Friday. And big thanks to you, Stephen. Thank you very much for such an interesting topic, and thank you for uniting with us again. And also, I would like to thank everyone who has been participating in this session and listening carefully, and also participating actively in this session. Thank you, everyone, and we will definitely be answering your questions and your comments on the next session, so please stay tuned. And one more time, thank you very much for joining us today, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a very great session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye, everyone.
Everyone stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a good day.